All right. So thank you all for joining us, whether it's morning or afternoon for you, depending where you are in the country. We appreciate you being here today. This is the second of our 4-part ICDP symposium, and we will be going for the next 2 additional Wednesdays. So hopefully you can join us for those as well. My name is Barb Clark, and I'm with the Intermountain Center for Disaster Preparedness. We are located here in Salt Lake City, Utah, for those of you who are not familiar with us. We had really hoped that by now we could be back to an in-person format, but when we were making these plans, the pandemic was still having a few little surges. So we thought, err on the safe side, we would continue to do this virtually. However, fingers crossed, next year we'll be able to produce this event as a hybrid. So those of you who want to can come in person, enjoy beautiful Salt Lake City area. And for those of you who are not able to travel, we'll be able to provide a virtual course as well. We know that the networking opportunities are not the same for those of you who are with us virtually. And if there's someone that you see in the participants list that you would love to get in touch with, please let me know and I'll do my best to connect you. A little bit more housekeeping. You are all muted when you joined, and we'd appreciate that you kept yourself muted unless we have opened the room for discussion. If you do not have your full name on your video screen, if you could please add your name so that we know who to give credit to. If you don't care about credit, don't worry about it. But if you do need credit or need a certificate of participation, if you could just make sure that your name is on your video screen. And to do that, just find the participants group, scooch over to the right a little bit. You'll see a button that says more, and then on there it says rename. So you can just add your name there. If you're watching with the group and everyone in the group needs some type of credit or participation certificate, please make sure that you either put it in the chat or email me everyone's name who happens to be in your group. And if you're calling in on the phone and if you need credit, just make sure that you email me at some point. I mentioned those certificates of participation. If you do need one, please email me. I put my email address in the chat, and pretty much all of you should have received an email or 12 from me, and you have my email address, but it's just barb.clark@imail.org, and that's just letter I, M-A-I-L. So the way we're going to run this today is our presenter will present for us. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. If it's something that's time sensitive to what he's speaking on at that point, I will interrupt him and ask the question. At the end, we will open it up to the group, and you're welcome at that time to unmute and ask your question verbally. All right, again, I just want to thank you all for supporting the Intermountain Center for Disaster Preparedness. And if the organization can be of any help to you and your groups, please feel free to reach out because we are here to help. All right, without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to our speaker today. Dr. John Comiskey is an associate professor of Homeland Security at Monmouth University. His research interests include climate security, mass shootings, and Homeland Security intelligence. He is co-editor of the Theoretical Foundations of Homeland Security, author of numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, and editor of the Journal of Security, Intelligence, and Preparedness Education. Dr. Comiskey is a retired New York City police lieutenant and a retired U.S. Coast Guard Reserve Senior Chief Petty Officer. Dr. Comiskey's professional experience includes law enforcement, intelligence, counterterrorism, and event and crisis management. Dr. Comiskey holds a BA in history and MS in social studies and secondary education from Queens College, an MS in Homeland Security from the Naval Postgraduate School, and his doctorate of education from St. John's Fisher College. He co-founded the Center for Homeland Defense and Security's Advanced Thinking in Homeland Security program. He's a retired marathoner and completed a marathon on all 7 continents. Wow, that's quite the accomplishment. His current interests includes hanging out with Maureen, his awesome wife of 33 years, and his occasional golf game. Please join me as we welcome Dr. Comiskey.
Well, Barbara, thank you very much. And as Barbara indicated, please, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat rooms. I'd love to be interrupted and kind of build on or just discuss what I'm talking about, or answer any questions that you may have. So to begin, climate change is a wicked problem. And what I mean, what's meant by the idea of a wicked problem, something that it's hard to get your hands around, and sometimes even hard to describe, and typically does not have any immediate or absolute answers. Now, climate change, some have said, is a super wicked problem. And there's 2 reasons for that. Policymakers and politicians, sometimes by necessity or preference, act in the short term, in their term of office. And some of those policymakers or politicians may well be responsible or partially responsible for the issue at hand, in this case, climate change. So today I'm going to talk about unpacking the National Intelligence Estimate on Climate Change, a 2001 national security document that was requested or ordered by the White House. It's important to understand what a national intelligence estimate is. Certainly there's a classified and unclassified version. We're going to be talking about the unclassified for obvious reasons. Having said that, I've been behind the gate on this, and there's very little of significance that's in the classified version, in which actually, by the way, as an intelligence officer, I can tell you is quite often the case. I've seen classified documents, and CNN would discuss the issue that night, and they had more information that was in the report. So that's something from behind the curtain that intelligence officers don't always share with you. So the genesis of myself and my colleagues, Dr. Larinaga and Carson, is the idea of how climate change might impact that Homeland Security mission space. And we were part of a program at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security looking at grand challenges. So for about 6 months, we looked at the science. We decided that we were agnostic. We really hadn't gotten past anything more than maybe a high school or college course in climate change, understanding the big picture. CO2 emissions are bad, causes greenhouse effect that wasn't really good for planet Earth. So for about 6 months, we took a look at the science. And because of our position there, we had great access to scientists from all over the country and from the U.S. government. And we pretty much looked at the science and said, yeah, the consensus of the science is fairly accurate. And that is greenhouse gas emissions coming from hydrocarbons are having a bad impact on the environment, and perhaps there's something that should be done to reduce them, or maybe even move towards renewables. And what we took a concept or a methodology called a pre-mortem methodology, which imagines a worst case scenario. Certainly the picture here on the screen, Isaac Cordial's Follow the Leader, takes an artistic liberty and takes the idea of, listen, the climate change did happen, happened catastrophically. And here we have leaders in floodwaters lamenting their failure of appropriate action. So what we did was we looked at something we were very familiar with, the 9/11 Commission, which I was part of, and reported out to them. In 2004, they looked at the 9/11 terrorist attacks and what our government knew and what they did or failed to do. And their really big finding was that we lacked a sense of imagination, failed to perceive that 19 men would hijack and weaponize 4 airplanes and crash them into the World Trade Center towers, the Pentagon, as well as a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. This was something that was very close to me I was a first responder, as was my sister, who was seriously injured in the attack. So again, it was something that I looked at and had, really kind of heartfelt. So using that as a model, we imagined a climate change commission that would, at some time in the future, about 2040, the year 2040, would similarly look back at climate change disasters, those worst case scenarios, and lament, hey, we knew a lot about this and we didn't take appropriate action. And here we are neck deep in water. So that was about 2-3 years ago where we were. And in part from presenting it from different groups, and particularly the American Industrial Hygiene Association, we had presented to FEMA and the Center for Homeland Defense and Security, the Army Corps of Engineers, as well as Northcom. And one of the pushbacks we got was we didn't talk enough about energy. We had actually just started to really take a good deep look at energy, and for the last year or so, that's where our focus has been. And we found that we might have a similar situation, an energy crisis or super energy crisis, where we don't have enough energy to do the things we want and need to do. And we're fans of energy in the sense of energy is about life, it's about sustaining life, it's about security, and it's about prosperity. So our direction now is to give really equal focus to our energy needs. So what we did was we took that same pre-mortem approach for both energy and climate change. So what does this mean for the people in this audience? And so I've been here, right? I'm retired 12 years, but I was a lieutenant in the New York City Police Department. I was a reservist in the Coast Guard. I was called back to active duty a number of times for the Iraqi War, for Hurricane Katrina, Deepwater Horizon. So I sat in the seats that you're sitting in just 12 short years ago. And I understand that you had pressing needs. You had your day-to-day. There are some of you who may be connected or deployed or know those deployed in Hurricane Ian and other disasters that, while this is great, okay, climate change is a concern, energy security is a concern, but how does it impact my day-to-day? So much of what I'm going to talk about is at a strategic level, but looking at our national preparedness guidance, I want you to think about our overarching task in Homeland Security, emergency management, national preparedness is to prevent or identify and mitigate those things that pose the greatest risk. So climate change and energy security are those things that are upstream that may well impact your day-to-day or your operations. So today I'm going to just briefly talk about climate and energy hazards and risks. I'm going to take a deep dive into the National Intelligence Assessment on Climate Change, tell you what I think is good about it, and I think the vast majority of it is good. Take one or two criticisms. And then I'm going to talk about the two pre-mortems we did on climate and energy, talk about the challenges of climate and energy and the opportunities inherent to that, and then share with you our recommendations. And those recommendations have actually, we've added to them in the last 6 months in a forthcoming publication. All right, so I'm going to begin with Camille Mora and his colleagues' 2018 finding. They're out of the University of Hawaii, and they identified 10 of the greatest hazards, things that can harm the U.S. and any other country. Certainly warming temperatures, heat waves, greater precipitation, more floods, more extreme events. What I want you to see where the arrow is indicating how each and every one of these has a direct impact on our homeland security missions, terrorism, border security, critical infrastructure, economic security, preparedness, and resilience, that all hazards type of planning. Now, I'm of the school of that homeland security and emergency management are entwined cousins. FEMA is a part of that organization, Department of Homeland Security. And the idea of a department, and I had to look it up in the Congressional Research Service, a department, as in the Department of Homeland Security or Department of Justice or Department of State, is simply a way to organize the government. So I'm of the school that Homeland Security and emergency management are entwined cousins. Now, the worst case scenario is down there in the red, is for a couple of studies, is abrupt climate change. Really low likelihood, high consequence event, something like the Greenland ice cover would to break apart or part of it and substantial or significantly really impact the sea level rise. Again, low probability, high consequence, but something that nonetheless that we have to concern ourselves with. So we did the same thing with energy. It was more on a macro level. What might interrupt our energy, whether it's an accident or an attack or aging infrastructure, or a really big surge attack or a war, as in the case of the Ukraine-Russian conflict. And what we know already is Europe is really concerned, Germany and France in particular, about freezing this winter. And what they have done is they've reanimated their coal-fired plants and are using emergency measures to get through this winter. They've lost a significant amount of their energy supply because of that conflict or that war with Ukraine. But imagine a number of those things happening at the same time. So as well as the disruptions, what are our surge requirements? We see that typically in the US in the summer. It's something that isn't really talked about enough in the community, and that is increased energy requirements. I'll talk a little more about the terawatt challenge on how developing nations like India and China their standard of living is increasing, and that's a good thing. But because of that, they're going to need a whole lot more energy. And then with some of the restrictions and prohibitions we've seen in the US and in Europe, where in our push for renewables, particularly in solar and wind, we're restricting ourselves from prohibiting access to energy that actually does exist, but we've decided not to use or not to use as much. So in the big picture, it's about getting energy to the people that we need, no matter where it comes from, certainly considering the possible greenhouse impacts or other hazards from any energy source. And we'll talk a little bit about nuclear as well. So here's the main part of the presentation today is the National Intelligence Estimate. The idea of a National Intelligence Estimate, the White House or Congress can call upon the National Security Council, which has access to the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus, CIA, FBI, Department of Defense, U.S. Treasury, transportation, just about anything within the purview of the intelligence community or the U.S. government. Having worked in the intelligence community, I can tell you that the budget's big, which is important, and the access that you are afforded is just about unrestricted. This is the budget's there, and you have a need to know without regards to anything in that area. As I said before, there's a classified version of this. This is the unclassified. We're going to discuss today for obvious reasons. But I can tell you for all practical reasons, there is little or no difference in the classified or the unclassified version. So this estimate, as do all, really have a template. You know, what some key judgments, identifying what is the scope or the purview of the estimate. What are the confidence levels, which is important. We talk about likelihoods and risks. They'll do the real content here, international responses and risks to the United States or perceived risks. And then they do a reverse, which is good for us. Events that could alter the national intelligence estimate. Say, well, based on what we know now, this is what may happen. But if these other events happen, that could certainly change the outcomes. And then the implications for national security or national interest. And that's a good thing to really talk about. You know, what is national security? National security at a macro level is what the White House decides it is. So something that may be in our national interest, something that we want to do, or policies we want to project, is largely in their purview of the White House to talk about a national security strategy, certainly with the consent and the governance of Congress as well. Okay, so the National Security Council made three big judgments. They looked at what they had available, and the three things they found was geopolitical tensions, how different governments operate, how they share information, how they get along, how they deal with trade, how do they deal with conflicts, that it's going to exacerbate geopolitical tensions. Two big questions: how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? The presumption there being that we should or must reduce on a global scale, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and answer the question: who is responsible? Is it the nation that is actually emitting it, or is it or the nation that is receiving goods that actually may have been the predicate for those greenhouse gas emissions? Second big finding was the physical effects of climate change. What we talked about: droughts, extreme weather events, sea level rise will exacerbate or make worse cross-border flashpoints, including water and migration, and perhaps a perceived need for something called geoengineering that I'll discuss just a little bit later. And finally, the big effects, the worst effects of climate change will be impact mostly developing nations. As you can see here, the countries, the darker the color, the more black the nation is, the worse off they're going to be. Big areas of concern: India, Pakistan, or Afghanistan, as well as what we call the Northern Triangle: Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. Just a point of interest: when we hear issues of concerns about border security in the U.S. with Mexico, well, the majority of people are actually coming from the Northern Triangle countries. Now, they may well be coming through Mexico, but this is their point of origin. Big areas of concern for us are obviously India, China, and that Northern Triangle. China really being an interesting country with geopolitically and certainly more recent developments. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the forthcoming slides. So again, I talked about the National Security Council and the National Intelligence Estimates will actually delineate: this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it. So the assessment is both near term, 5 to 10 years, medium term, 10 to 20 years. They explicitly tell us, listen, we're aware of extreme views, deniers, and alarmists, people who deny the existence, maybe it's skeptics, all the way up to alarmists who may, by inference, may be exaggerating the science or acting or using it to advance their policies. They also found something that I don't necessarily agree with, that or certainly the pre-mortem methodology counters that there'll be no big event or precipitating event or focusing event that would sharply address how we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So that's something I play with a little bit, not necessarily sure that will be the case. Confidence level, very important here. We're going to talk about some of our recommendations, how this might counter this. And certainly we're in agreement. But the first one is high confidence that global projections of temperature increase will happen. We know that. We have the data. Greenhouse gas emissions, hydrocarbons, are in fact increasing our global temperatures. They have moderate confidence in regional projections of how it's going to impact regions per se, as well as moderate confidence in our ability to decarbonize the energy sector. We disagree with the moderate confidence here in the second one. We have low confidence that the energy sector will be able to decarbonize in the near future. And we're talking our ideas maybe 25 to 50 years before we'll reach those goals that we want. I'm not saying that they're not good goals, but our confidence in reaching them is on more low. Here, they are more moderate. They have low confidence that the impacts could cascade in ways that may impact national security. We actually think that this is an underestimate here. We have moderate confidence that it could do just that. And our pre-mortem actually demonstrates how that may well be the case. And I'll go a little into the pre-mortem, give you an example of what that really is about. But risk, the risk here, they delineate the risk last year up until 2040. Risk is generally perceived as an unwanted or an unfavorable outcome. And certainly, as you can see, the risk elevate from 2030 to 2040. Areas of concern for that Homeland Security enterprise, and that would include police, fire, EMS, Coast Guard, National Guard, military, public health, the private sector, will impact the need or surge needs for our response, for our prevention, mitigation, as well as our response. Our sense is, our findings suggest that we need a much greater surge capability. Here's why it's important to read the bottom line. I think this is a great bottom line. I think it should, that the intelligence community could have been a little more prominent here, and that is, this does not include or account for actions that may mitigate those risks. Well, that's the point. The point is, if we mitigate these risks, which I believe we can, or at least some of them, we can actually reduce our risk factor. So my sense is, great to read the bottom line. I actually use this in class and tell my students, this is why you read the bottom line. I just felt they should have been more prominent had a more prominent place or role in there. All right. Another really good thing that they did here was they said, okay, this is where we see the world moving with climate change here. But here's a couple of things that could happen that may actually change the scope and our confidence levels. Breakthroughs in zero carbon energies and other technologies. And we're seeing some of those things actually happen in hydro, some promising, some fusion 2.0 as opposed to fission for nuclear. That's something that is happening. Some climate disaster that mobilizes massive collective action, or an Arctic conflict, which we're actually starting to see some of those things happen in the Arctic, with Russia really showing, flexing their muscles, if you will. And then here, the China flag, you can see to the right, why China. China, in their public statements and policy statements, has identified themselves as a, quote, near Arctic nation. I'm not a geography expert, but my sense is that China is anywhere close to the Arctic, but they're in policy or stating that they are an Arctic. So that they too, they have more ice cutters than the U.S., probably about triple what we have, which doesn't bode well for the Coast Guard, my legacy agency, or the Navy, or as well geotechnology, geoengineering technologies seeding the clouds may actually disrupt weather patterns. I think there's a real low probability of that happening. They concur with that it could happen, but probably unlikely that it would happen anytime in the near future. All right, that's the real macro level of the national intelligence estimate of what it may mean for the national security community, as well as the Homeland Security community. Now, their target audience to that was the national security community. Certainly, it has implications for Homeland Security and emergency management, but we weren't necessarily the primary target. So just give you a good sense of the pre-mortem methodology. There's variations of this. The idea here is you pretend that an operation or a mission or a job failed completely. The idea of an autopsy is somebody dies, and for any number of reasons, or whether it's a homicide or accidental, you want to establish the cause of death. In the idea of a pre-mortem is, we don't want to have that after action report. We don't want to have that 9/11 commission, that energy commission, that climate change commission, but let's pretend we did. And imagine what would that commission likely find? It can give us some ideas about possibilistic thinking, what was possible, perspective thinking, and hindsight thinking. Helps us raise a whole lot of questions. What's happening? What will likely happen? Really asking that question over and over. and hopefully provide some smart answers, what to do and what not to do. This methodology has been used by new countries, by the reconstituted South Africa, by Shell, certainly to predict oil futures, and very successful. So there's been some really very high level applications of that pre-mortem methodology. All right, so the first one we did this in 2018. We published it in the Homeland Security Affairs. Myself and Dr. Larinaga, Dr. Carlson joined us for the second and third publication. We took every unclassified intelligence estimate we could, every DoD, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, the best science that we had available. We had on faculty at the Naval Postgraduate School, the lead author for the U.S. component of the U.S. government climate change project. So we actually got to speak to some pretty high level scientists as well as some policy papers. And what we based on that, we established a series of events or disasters that would cascade for a 10-year period for 2030 to 2039, based on what's called representative concentration pathways, projections of greenhouse gas emissions. We identified a series of cascading crises and disasters, as well as at the end of that 10-year period, a sense of national trauma. And I think a really good example would be somewhat where we are today, 2 years after COVID, where we feel a little beat up. I know at my university, we're seeing the incoming freshmen. They're different. I'm not a clinician, but those 2 years of being socially distant had some kind of impact on them. Well, imagine 10 years of repeated disasters. Your emergency service sector people would be tired, would be exhausted. The population would be exhausted. In 2017, we had those three really big hurricanes in Texas, Puerto Rico, and Florida. We had terrible wildfires in the Midwest. We had one of our worst years for natural disasters, and we saw then. This is just prior to a little bit prior, 2 years prior to COVID. We saw that our surge capability was diminishing. But imagine now 10 years of that. That's the mindset where you have a tired workforce, you have a tired population, a population that is overwhelmingly traumatized by that. And then we have that big, real terrible year where we have a great flood in parts of the Midwest, long hot summer, repeated blackouts, high crime rates, a really Hurricane Katrina, hurricane of that magnitude, really knocking out 3 states. We have crisis in the Arctic with Russia, perhaps China, really impacting our DoD's capabilities. And then we have the border crisis we have today. Imagine something 3 or 4-fold worse than that. The outcomes of that commission would find, and our commission found, or again, our hypothetical commission, that we failed to act responsibly. We didn't do enough. We didn't mitigate the disaster as much as we could have. We didn't create that surge capability. Our biggest finding was FEMA, and FEMA being our hypothetical master in this, would need to have like a super surge capability. Ultimately, as was the case for 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina, and arguably for COVID, now this research predates COVID, we were unprepared for climate change. That was our findings from our initial research. Now, in the last year or so, we've turned to energy security, looked at its impact economically and environmentally. And what we did was something similar to what we did, not similar, exactly the same for climate change, where we had repeated energy crises, things like the Ukraine crisis, things like a large vessel being stuck in the Suez Canal. We've actually seen that. And this increased demand, particularly from countries such as India and China, impacting world energy supplies. Similar things happen here in the United States, where we have that increased energy needs. We have drought-like conditions that we are seeing. They get worse. We don't have the electricity to pump that water. Much of that water for crops is actually pumped. There's an energy, or it could be electric, could be others, an energy component to that. We have that long, hot summer, multiple grid failures, energy sector attacks. We're actually seeing an increase in critical infrastructure attacks by terrorists, and particularly the energy sector. Again, an Arctic conflict that might actually elevate into a second Cold War. Same outcome we had for the climate change. We failed to act responsibly, didn't realize ours and the world's energy needs and how that could impact our security. We were unprepared for the energy crisis. So that, by the way, the second one, the energy one, a little easier for us. We actually saw it. We actually knew the outcome, or predicted our outcome prior to actually beginning the research. But here's a couple of big things to understand at a very macro level. It's the challenges and opportunities for climate change. And the one on a global level, is called the increased energy demand. It's not just China and India, it's sub-Saharan Africa, it's South America. It's called the terawatt challenge. Currently, globally, we use 6 to 7 terawatts of energy annually. A terawatt, 1 terawatt is 1 trillion watts. It's a lot. It's a tremendous amount of power because of increased standards of living, in particularly, again, India and China and sub-Saharan Africa. We're going to double globally our energy needs. So the challenge is, and as stated the best by Bill Gates in his book from last year, 2021, if you're interested in climate change, I do recommend you do read it. He asked us to focus on the 5 things. If we want a zero carbon or a net zero pathways, we have to identify 5 things: how to generate electricity. So it's important to understand that other than thunder, though we can't harvest, energy is a secondary energy. It's generated from nuclear, solar, wind, gas, coal, hydro, and others. How do we grow food? How do we make things like cement and steel? How do we move around? Transportation. How do we keep warm and cool? Those 5 things. These are the innovations that we need. The other challenges are unsettled science and climate change risk communication. I've already said we largely agree with the consensus of climate change scientists that says that CO2 hydrocarbons are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, and we should do what's important, what's possible or feasible to remedy that. But as a scientist, we must always talk about that there are hypotheticals. Nothing is 100% settled, although it's nearly there. And then another piece of the Paris Climate Accord, the nationally determined contributions, something that is not talked about enough. The idea of the Paris Climate Accords is every nation that signs on to it, and most nations did, with the exception of India. China signed on to it, but we don't believe them, we don't trust them, and Russia did not sign on. The idea is that every nation would promise to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions significantly, and there's a number attributed to that. Problem with that is they're not enforceable. It's entirely up to the nation whether or not they actually do that. And we're seeing a number of nations actually falling back on that. The US actually is on track to meet theirs. And interestingly enough, to our north, Canada is not. Okay, so what are the opportunities? Well, the Paris Climate Accord in and of itself is historical, that we can get most of the nations of the world to actually agree on something, and whether or not they actually have some enforcement mechanism to do that is to be seen. Let's see what does happen. We are finding ways to adapt. We are creating something called a smart grid, using energy smarter, and probably our 2 biggest areas for improvement. Nuclear energy. Up until about 2 years ago, I wasn't a fan of nuclear. Now I'm a #1 fan of nuclear. If we're gonna go to renewables, we need nuclear. I don't see any other solution. What will play a bigger role is battery. Right now, battery storage is a mega problem. I think it's such a big problem that we're actually going to address that. So after 5 years of research, our recommendations are still at a macro level. is really scaling innovation, and we're seeing that. We're throwing billions or not trillions of dollars into research and development. Certainly looking at an enforcement mechanism for those NDCs, nationally determined contributions. Something I haven't talked about till now, but amending the Stafford Act to include what we call slow-moving disasters. We consider climate change to be a slow-moving disaster. Grant funding for mitigation for climate change per se is not allowed by the Stafford Act. We think that the Stafford Act should be amended to address that. And the final piece would recommendation is climate change risk communication and education. All too often we see news reporting about attributing Hurricane Katrina or Superstorm Sandy to climate change. Now we feel that that's a problem, and what we've brought to our attention by a book by Stephen Koonin, another book I absolutely recommend, is some of the actual findings in the IPC report that actually identify that the IPC, that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that big UN body, has low confidence in the increase in droughts, the frequency of floods on a global scale, and large scale, more intense extreme weather events. Every one of these things is not reported in the news. Actually, the opposite is reported in the news. I got that information from Koonin's book, but I went to the IPC report. So again, back to that final recommendation, when we're educating ourselves, we're educating our children, we should have some real climate change risk communication education that is based on real science, also including that notion that all science really can be improved upon. So I apologize for talking real fast. I am from New York. It's kind of how I roll. I think that completes my yes. All right, Barbara, time for a Q&A.
All right. Anyone have any questions while you're thinking about that? There was one question a little bit earlier on from Sarah. She said, why is there no data indicated for Greenland? I think that was way back in the earlier slides.
It's data with respect to its, what kind of data you're looking for the ice caps or its energy use?
So you showed a map on slide 6, and Greenland was the only area that indicated there was no data. And I just wondered why, because they're relatively developed.
Okay, yeah, oh, okay. I don't know, but I'll tell you what, please email me and I'm gonna find out. I've been there. I'm guessing that I'm guessing here that they don't really have a problem with energy. They like Iceland have some geothermal. I know Iceland's one of the bigger nations for geothermal. I don't know if that's the case for Greenland. I think that's probably a good thing. Again, I'm a little hypothesizing there that they're not a country of concern for greenhouse gas emissions, low population density, and they have not only the ice cap, but there is some good information that they have a lot of people are buying offshore for Greenland because there's beliefs there's some real big fossil fuel deposits there, and if the ice caps do devolve, we may actually have access to that, but I don't have a better answer than that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, there is from Brian here. He says, do you have any thoughts on recent research? And he gives suggesting an increase in interpersonal violence as temperatures increase and the implications on emergency management. The threat of violent incidents seem to be rising on several fronts.
Yeah, well, we actually touch on that. There's a theory called strain theory, and I forget his first name, might be Robert Agnew. He actually came up with a theory called general strain theory maybe 20 years ago, and he actually built on his research indicating that climate change, temperature rise, would likely result in increased crime. The data on temperatures and correlation to crime is big. The hotter temperatures will increase crime. A cop's best friend are cold temperatures. People commit less crime in cold temperatures. Long, hot summers in big cities, crime rates always go up. And there may be exceptions or outliers. So there would absolutely be a correlation for that, for the policing and EMS or trauma centers responding. So increased temperatures would result in high likelihood result in higher crime.
And then Joe asked, she said, I'm multitasking, so I may have missed it, but when you say low confidence, is that meaning that you have low confidence that Superstorm Sandy and Hurricane Katrina were not caused by climate change?
I have low confidence that we can attribute it specifically. Every physicist or meteorologist told me it's dangerous to correlate or say that an event, a superstorm Sandy or Hurricane Katrina, with two really big ones, and Al Gore did it. I think he did it with both of them. It's really not good science because it's actually very difficult to demonstrate. Now, I wouldn't disagree that climate change and increased temperatures may well contribute to the intensity as well as the frequency of extreme weather events. But when it's called event attribution or attribution science, it's very difficult to do. So I think I want to be trusted, and I want to trust people, scientists who are telling me things. So if you say, and Al Gore did it, and I like him. I've met him a few times. We call it in psychology an availability heuristic, or we play on availability biases, like where we use an event to draw attention, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can do that for a good reason. So 9/11 is a focusing event. It draws our attention to a problem. We saw a big change in U.S. government, greatest reorganization in U.S. government since World War II. Hurricane Katrina happens. We realize, hey, the same people, or a lot of the same people that are responding to terrorism or involved in terrorism are also involved in natural disasters. And any kind of cost-benefit analysis will tell you that there's a far greater risk of a natural disaster than a terrorist event. So that focusing our attention, we redeploy our resources. So the best response I can have is it's not a good idea for scientists or politicians or policymakers to attribute an event that's complex and may have other events. I've seen very little of it. I actually told them, I'm surprised we haven't seen more of it with Hurricane Ian. You can Google it. There's not a lot out there. I thought there would be a little bit more. A week ago, I said to my students, look for that. I teach a class called Psychology of Intelligence Analysis, and it refers to availability bias, availability heuristics, and availability entrepreneurs, people who will take an event because it supports their agenda.
So Chandra has a follow-up to Joe's question, which is what your answer was there, but what about the temperature of water? The sea and the ocean warming, is that considered a cause?
I would say that, so if the ambient temperature increases, so will the ocean temperature. So yeah, that's I think the science is pretty clear on that as well.
And apparently I have an echo, so my apologies. So how do we ensure policy? Is there anyone else that is unmuted besides John? Maybe when I'm talking, we get that. Thank you. How do we ensure policymakers consider our future rather than the now when it comes to climate change? It feels like whenever an administration changes, the approach changes.
Yeah, I think that's I would comment on this, and I would say, my colleagues and I felt that the previous administration didn't do enough, and the current one is doing too much. It's really too extremes. And we have made a real big point of this being apolitical. And so the idea of the current policy seems to be that solar and wind are the answer. And we know they're part of the answer. Depending on who you ask, maybe 5 to 12% of our current global energy comes from solar and wind. Let's go the high number. Let's go 12%. I think that's a fair number. It may go to 19 or 20% by 2030 to 2040. Let's go high. That's 25%. And that's a really good number for that. And so that's a great addition to our energy mix. So where does that other 75% come from? Again, 2 years ago, I was not pro-nuclear. If you want clean emissions, you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I see no other way than to go nuclear. I think a pathway to that is natural gas. We're still going to be burning fossil fuels for another 25 plus years. We have countries like India and Russia, and India being more important to the size, are not signing on to they're doing coal, they're doing gas, they may go nuclear. So in that sense, I think we change administration when we go to extremes. I think that is problematic in that sense. What we need, and that's part of that, climate education, really making a sense of the cost benefit analysis. And energy is a great thing. Energy is literally helping developed nations develop. What's our standard of value? And mine is, and ours, my colleagues and I, is human life. So if burning gas and oil is going to advance the standard of living for people in India, that's what they should do until we can get to natural gas and nuclear. That will save more lives that way. I think India is probably the best example just because of the size. And I do agree. I think it's problematic when you could have a new administration in 2 years that could change some of these policies too much. The shale gal what we had, I think we missed an opportunity there when we had the change of administrations, but there was good and bad, I would say, on both policies. And again, we really try, we make a big effort to just look at the policies, and I don't name the administrations, I'll say previous and current for that very reason.
So Jeff asked, what about propane?
Sorry, what about?
What about propane? When you were talking about the difference.
Well, propane isn't that natural gas? That's part of natural gas. I heat my house with propane gas, by the way. And I'm looking into solar. I'm actually just put in a pool, so I'm looking into the numbers like I knew house 2 years ago. So propane, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, but propane is natural gas or a byproduct of gas. And now I'm going to Google that myself, by the way, just so I'm sure on that.
Great. Okay, and then Vince asked, how do you expect, you know what, hey, John, while I'm reading the question, would you mind muting for just a second, see if that echo goes away? Thanks. So how do you expect public-private partnerships to continue during the prep response as climate-related events increase in frequency and severity? The private sector, like healthcare, utilities, energy, are part of the front lines for many of these hazards types and can lack the necessary resourcing to serve in those events, especially as they become more frequent.
That's the best question. The other questions were good, but I like that the best. Insofar as this, just go with a planning assumption that FEMA is in charge of national surge capability. I understand there's an enterprise in the state level governments, but and we could probably scale this to the states as well. We need a greater surge capability. We need a greater surge capability for our first responders, for our first preventers, if you will, and certainly we have these pallets of water and foodstuffs. We may well need pallets of generators.
All right. Anyone else have any other questions? No? Can you expand on the health impacts of climate change?
Yeah, a couple of big ones. Higher temperatures is going to impact just about every workforce. Road crews are going to have different. We see this in places like Florida and Texas. They work earlier in the day, but their work day is going to be shorter. We're going to see more heat stress, more heat-related diseases. So that's probably the biggest impact we're going to see in the healthcare, as well as victims of violent crime. We'll see more of that. But I'd say the heat stress would be the bigger ones. And it's certainly the American Industrial Hygiene Association, we were out there, their big concern is how it's going to impact the workforces.
Anyone else have a question? Okay. Taylor is asking, you talk about issues with batteries. Can you expand on that issue and how we can work around that in the future?
That is for the future. So particularly, what you want to do is you want to create energy where you use it. That's not always possible. Solar and wind, the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. We need to store some of that in batteries. We have, and Tesla is working on this, as are others. We have limited battery storage capabilities. That's the area that I see as one of the biggest ones for growth. Elon Musk and Tesla and others are on that. That's going to happen. I'm hopeful in that. I'm not involved in that industry, but we need to be able to store energy better. That I think is going to be one of the biggest innovations in energy. Maybe not in our lifetimes. We're going to see hydrogen. That's something maybe far in the future. I think more nuclear 2.0, but the batteries are always going to be part of it. Certainly, it's a big part of the electric vehicle. I wanted to buy an electric vehicle. I think it's too early for them. Certainly, I'm a big fan of hybrids because you can always get from point A to point B. I think we're certainly not ready. The infrastructure. I don't want to wait 45 minutes to charge my battery for a car. So that's where the growth is going to be. Maybe 10 years. I might be optimistic where we have EVs really being a big part of our world.
And then DD asked, is there any data on suicide rates increasing that you've seen?
I don't know. I would speculate that I do know that higher temperatures will contribute to suicides, but it's not my particular area. But I would hypothesize that higher temperatures will likely result in more suicides, more mental health issues writ large.
Roger's asking about the environmental concerns with batteries, such as mining and minerals needed.
Yeah, that's another really great question, right? Solar and wind particularly require nickel, lithium, aluminum, and so we have to mine for them. So there's two issues. We have to mine for them. What is the environmental degradation of that? That's any energy has a negative component, right? We go to nuclear. How do you store the waste? But also with the batteries, there's another security concern with rare earths. China may have about 80% of the rare earth resources, but whether financially or nationally. So that became a great security issue. So yes, recycling batteries themselves are an environmental issue.
Anyone else? While you're typing, I actually have a question. So what do you see as the primary intelligence concern with everything that we've just talked about with the energy demands and stuff? I mean, what should we as everyday citizens be on the lookout for? So that's kind of two different questions.
On a real intelligence level, my greatest concern is disinformation campaigns by the Russian government with respect to bad malinformation with respect to energy. And one of the things the Russian government, you can Google this, Putin really criticized our use of shale energy. I'm not a, it really did contribute to our national security. There was some environmental concerns, but shale gas is something I think that we should have used. And for him or other people from the Russian government or to be criticizing our use of them when they're doing the same or would do the same. So there's disinformation campaigns about climate energy that I'm concerned about. And that goes to why we should really be working on our climate education, K to 12, as well as college, and on a bigger level, really being concerned about disinformation on the internet for climate change or just about anything else. The amount of information campaigns out there on every issue foreseeable are there, but there are Russian disinformation campaigns with respect to climate change. And they're not alone, China as well.
Lillian wants to know, what about climate change in the ag industry? Should we consider eating less meat?
Quite honestly, I like a steak. I have high cholesterol, so I'm supposed to be eating less of it. I think it's methane from if we ate less beef, perhaps there would be. Here's I just too honest, I guess. But those same countries that are developing, well, they're eating more meat. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to eat meat. So I think we're going to actually see more of that. I also think that the amount of methane and its impact. We always focus on greenhouse gas because that's about 80%. Methane's actually probably a little more harmful, but it doesn't stay in the environment as much. It's a smaller number. So will it have an impact? My sense, it'll be minuscule.
And then Vicky is asking, what are the top things the average citizen can do to help with climate change?
I'd say conserve energy. I think we're very wasteful. I don't like waste. I think we leave our windows open, keep our thermostat on. Smart thermostats really, and you will save money. Get an environment, a good car that has low mileage. Don't get these big SUVs. You may like them, but they're really you're just burning more gas. I think that would be probably our biggest piece there. Smart technologies. We're starting to see this smart houses where you have the better windows, better thermostats. Regulating. We have an app for everything, right? You can, if you're out of your house for 8-10 hours, you can lower the temperature while you're gone. You can have it heat up or cool down on your way home. I think those would be the bigger ones.
All right, anyone else? And I see nothing else in the chat. So Dr. Comiskey, thank you so much. This was great information. A lot of work that went into this, and we very much appreciate you sharing both the study and the report and your expertise with us. So thank you very much. If anyone needs a certificate of participation, please make sure you email me, barb.clark@imail.org. And I did put the link to the survey in the chat. And if you did not get to watch all of this, we will post the video on our YouTube channel, and I will send you that link shortly. So if you have free time next Wednesday, we hope you'll join us for the third of our 4 symposiums. We will have Dr. Joseph A. Barbera joining us, and he'll talk about his experiences with leadership for different types of crises like hurricanes, tsunamis, bombings. He too has been to many of these different crises around the world. So please join us next Wednesday, same time, same place. Well, not same place, I'll send you a different link. but same time, 11:30 Mountain Daylight Time. So again, Dr. Comiskey, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, and it was great to see you again. And we hope you all stay safe and stay well, and we'll see you all next week, hopefully. Thank you.